Hello everyone, welcome to our asynchronous snow day lecture on natural selection. Now this may be a review for many of you, but it also might include some new information for some of you, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about this material. As we talked about in our first class, the study of behavioral ecology focuses heavily on how ecological factors drive the evolution of behaviors. So to talk about that, we need to make sure that we're all on the same page about some of the basics of evolution. If we're going to discuss evolution, we need to start by defining it. You might have heard different versions on the definition of evolution in different courses, maybe in high school or in intro biology. Pause for just a moment and try to think of the definitions that you've heard for evolution. So one of the simplest ways we can define evolution is the gradual process through which species change over time. You might have heard this definition somewhere in the past worded simply as descent with modification. This just means that from one generation to the next, there are changes in the species traits and in the genes that cause those traits. A more technical or biological definition might be to say that evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population or species across generations. If you don't remember what an allele is, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes, but simply put, remember alleles are different versions of genes. For example, one allele for eye color might produce blue eyes, while another might produce brown eyes. When a particular allele becomes more or less common in a population or species than it was in the past, that's evolution. So evolution can also be defined as a change in the genetic makeup of a species over time. Why is understanding evolution so important for the study of animal behavior? Well, evolution is what we call a unifying theory in biology. That means that it ties everything else together. This was perhaps best stated by Theodosius Dobzhansky, a prominent scientist in the early to mid-1900s who studied genetics and evolutionary biology. He combined evidence from these two different fields to show how evolution by natural selection could produce new species, and that was a really important advancement in our understanding of evolutionary processes. Dobzhansky famously said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Whether we're studying anatomy, physiology, behavior, or some other aspect of biological organisms, evolution has played a role in shaping the traits and interactions that we see today. All right, let's do a quick review of some basic genetic concepts. We'll start with some key vocabulary. First is genotype. Genotype is an organism's genetic makeup, basically what genes or what versions of a gene an organism possesses. Genotype influences phenotype. Phenotype is the observable properties of an organism. So this could be morphology, basically their structure, their development, aspects of their physiology, and their behavior. And as we already mentioned, alleles are different or alternate forms of a gene. All right, let's look at an example. In rabbits, coat color is controlled by one gene. We call it the C gene for color. And that gene has at least 4 alleles. That's 4 different versions of the coat color gene. The big C gene, so the capital C that you see on the slide, indicates full color. It's considered what we call the wild type, and it produces the typical darker rabbit coloration. The next one over you see is the chinchilla allele, which is marked with a lowercase c and then CHD for chinchilla dark. And that produces a lighter gray color. The CH allele, little c with an H, for Himalayan, produces a white rabbit with gray ears, nose, and feet. And finally, the little c allele produces the albino trait. Remember that as diploid organisms, each rabbit will have 2 copies of this gene. They might have 2 of the same allele, in which case we'd say they're homozygous. Or they might have 2 different alleles, in which case we would say they're heterozygous. So if they're heterozygous, which color do they express? How do we know what their phenotype would be? Well, in this example, big C, the darker gray, Wild type is what we call dominant. It's expressed or manifested in the organism as long as there's one copy of that allele present. The other variations of the coat color allele shown here are all recessive to that big C dark gray wild type allele. That means they're masked by it. It might be there in their genome, one copy of it, but you don't see it in their phenotype because you see that dominant allele. The other alleles listed here have dominance relationships too, with chinchilla masking Himalayan and everything masking albino. To get an albino rabbit, you need 2 copies of that albino allele. In some cases, this is a whole lot simpler, such as when there are only 2 possible alleles for a trait, one dominant, one recessive. But regardless of the number of alleles or the complexity of the genetic system, the important thing to remember is that the combination of alleles represents an individual's genotype, and the trait expressed as a result is its phenotype. To talk about evolution by natural selection, we need to introduce another term, fitness. Fitness is an individual's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment. As this figure shows, individuals that are more fit or have higher fitness are more likely to have successful offspring and pass on their genes to subsequent generations. Finally, we need to talk about the term adaptations. Some traits are associated with higher fitness in a given environment than other traits. Alleles that generate traits that increase the fitness of an individual will increase in frequency over generations. Because of the advantages they confer, the individuals that have these traits tend to survive longer and produce more offspring. Because the traits are genetic in nature, they're passed on to these offspring and become more common in subsequent generations. These traits that are molded by natural selection in this way are called adaptations, which are traits associated with the highest relative fitness in a given environment. Check out the many interesting adaptations this sea otter has to survive in its cold aquatic environment. Before we review the process of natural selection, let's talk about some important people who contributed to our understanding of evolution by natural selection. You've likely all heard of Charles Darwin. As a naturalist and geologist, he participated in the voyage of the HMS Beagle, a British Navy ship sent to survey the coast of South America. While in the Galapagos Islands, he observed the finches and other species there, which helped him to formulate the theory of evolution by natural selection, which he published in his famous book called On the Origin of Species. Around the same time, another man named Alfred Russel Wallace was also contributing to the idea of natural selection independently and actually prior to Darwin's published work. He also explored South America, spending about 4 years in Brazil's Amazon River basin, collecting butterflies, other insects, and birds, trying to understand the origin of various species. He also discovered the boundary line between animals from the Australian and Asian regions, which is called the Wallace Line, and which helped him and others to understand the movement of tectonic plates and how that impacted the distribution of flora and fauna around the world. Finally, I want to highlight husband and wife teammates Peter and Rosemary Grant. The Grants have studied Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands since the early 1970s. They've studied the ecology, behavior, and genetics of the finches to understand the process of natural selection, and they have published a ton of work on this. One of my favorite papers is called Songs of Darwin's Finches Diverge When a New Species Enters the Community, Implications for Speciation. Sounds exciting, right? It really is. It's all about how there's a learning-based bias for song evolution and speciation in these finch species. I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to hear the Grants speak about this research. They came to Buffalo to give a lecture, and it was really exciting to hear. Reading a paper is great, but hearing all about it and what went into it from the authors is always something I really enjoy having the opportunity to do. Now that we have some of the background down, let's talk about natural selection. Natural selection operates on behaviors and other traits according to 4 prerequisites. We often refer to these as Darwin's postulates, despite the fact that these ideas were also independently proposed by Alfred Russel Wallace. The first of these postulates or prerequisites is variation. For natural selection to occur, there must be variation in the trait. For example, this butterfly you see in the first box comes in different colors. There's variation between individuals. However, that variation also has to be heritable. That means it must be the result of a genotype that can be passed to offspring. Our second prerequisite or postulate is competition. There has to be competition among individuals that allows some to survive and some not to. Resources have to be limited in some way in relation to the trait, right? This could be limited food, limited high quality territory, limited places to hide from predators. Some environmental constraint that causes competition among individuals. This requirement is pretty much always met because by definition, resources are usually limited. The third postulate is adaptations, right? There have to be fitness consequences to trait variations. Some traits have to confer an advantage over others. Since the environment can't support unlimited population growth, not all individuals will survive and reproduce to their full potential. Individuals with more beneficial traits in a particular environment are the ones who will survive and reproduce more successfully. Finally, our fourth postulate or prerequisite is selection. Basically, because variability confers an advantage in a particular environment and is heritable over generations, there will be a change in allele frequencies as we see those beneficial traits passed on more often and those alleles become more prevalent in the population. Okay, let's quickly walk through an example of evolution by natural selection on a morphological or physical trait. In this case, we're looking at a population of beetles that vary in color. They can be either green or they can be brown. Not all of the beetles will survive. They're preyed on by birds, and those birds forage by sight. They're going to eat the beetles they can see. Because the beetles live in a dirt habitat, the brown beetles have an advantage. They blend in, they're camouflaged. The green ones stand out and are seen much more easily and so are more likely to be eaten. Assuming color here is genetically controlled over generations, we would expect the population to include more and more brown beetles, right? The brown beetles are eaten less, they survive more because of that color, and they pass on that trait to future generations. This is evolution by natural selection. Remember that natural selection acts on phenotypes. It's the trait, the color here, that's providing the advantage. But natural selection affects genotypes in subsequent generations. It's the genes that are being passed on to the offspring. Also remember that natural selection is driven by the environment. Some aspect of the environment acts as what we might call an agent of selection or a selection pressure. In this case, it's those foraging birds that fill this role. So what do you think would happen if the environment changed and the dirt habitat in which the beetles live suddenly started to become covered with green grass, assuming the beetles could still survive in a grassy environment? What do you think would happen to the evolutionary trajectory, right? What would happen to the color of the beetles? Take a second, just think about it. Yeah, in that case, the advantage would shift potentially to the green beetles, right? Green would become the adaptation that conferred higher fitness in this new environment. And we might expect to see brown beetles be less able to survive and reproduce, and green beetles would start to become more common. So it's just an important thing to remember that what is adaptive in one environment may not be adaptive in a different environment or if the environment changes. Since our examples so far have pretty much all dealt with physical adaptations, I just want to mention that behaviors are also adaptations, right? Often physical and behavioral adaptations go together. For example, this polar bear has many physical characteristics that help it survive, but it also has behavioral adaptations, such as digging dens for protection from the wind. Together, an animal's physical and behavioral adaptations help to maximize its fitness in its environment. So there are lots of misconceptions out there about evolution and natural selection. It's important for us to remember how natural selection works and keep its limitations in mind. Pause for just a moment and see if you can figure out what misconception about evolution this cartoon is depicting. So one common misconception is that natural selection produces the best possible trait for a particular situation, but that's not the case. Remember that natural selection is merely acting on the genetic material that's already present in an organism. So as helpful as a chainsaw hand might be for a beaver, there's just no genetic basis for that to happen. Basically, natural selection doesn't produce new traits. There is, however, one process that can provide new traits, or at least cause changes to existing ones. Do you know what that process might be? If you said mutation, you were correct. Mutation is the process by which random changes occur in DNA. Mutations sometimes cause no change in phenotype at all, but in other cases, they can produce changes in traits that may be beneficial or harmful to the organism. So does evolution always result in adaptations? To answer that, we need to look at all the ways that evolution can happen. Remember, evolution is the process by which organisms change over generations. Natural selection, which we just reviewed, is one of the basic mechanisms of evolution, but there are others. Mutation, which we just mentioned, gene flow, and genetic drift. So remember, a mutation is any change in genetic structure, in DNA. Mutations can produce new alleles, and that alone changes allele frequencies, making mutation itself a mechanism of evolutionary change. However, mutations are random, so on their own, they don't lead to adaptations directly. However, if a mutation produces a change that results in a new phenotype, natural selection might then act on it to make it more or less prevalent. Gene flow is the movement of genes in or out of a population, such as through migration or dispersal. When individuals move, they bring their genes with them. Which individuals, and therefore which alleles, are moving in or out of a population is usually pretty random. So again, this mechanism of evolution doesn't directly lead to adaptations. Finally, genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies that happens due to chance events. In some cases, it can even lead to the disappearance of alleles from a population. For example, if you look at the example on the slide, if all the individuals with a specific allele or genotype, in this case the green beetles, ended up dying randomly before reproducing, in this case because someone stepped on them all, this would cause a change in the genetic makeup of the population. However, the survivors here weren't better suited to the environment, they were just lucky. By definition, genetic drift is a random process, and its effects are only strong in very small populations. One real-world example of this that comes to my mind was the loss of many parrots in a 2017 hurricane in Puerto Rico. The population was reduced to just a few surviving birds, and it likely reduced the genetic diversity of that remaining population a lot. But the survivors in that population, they weren't better equipped, better adapted to survive a hurricane. They were just the ones that were lucky and weren't killed. So this is almost certainly an example of genetic drift in action. So the take home here is not all forms of evolution lead to adaptations. Only natural selection acts specifically on traits that confer higher fitness. Only natural selection is acting in a way that creates a closer fit between organism and environment. Other mechanisms of evolution don't do that. However, they do change the genetic makeup of a population or species, which can then be further acted on by natural selection. All right, that brings us to the end of our material on evolution and natural selection. Make sure to watch the other video posted here for this asynchronous class as well, because we'll be applying information from both of these next class. If you still feel like you need or just want some more review on these evolution concepts, make sure to check out the reading and video that are posted on D2L. That's all, folks. Have a great day.